Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listen, I think we all agree this is a big problem. It's my definition of a problem. There's no easy solution. As chairman of this committee, I would meet with Facebook, and I appreciate what they were trying to do to pull down Islamic terror type of content. So I think we all agree that we don't want to be disseminating extremist, violent, inducing type of behavior through these platforms, but we also need to protect free speech as well. So it's a real tension. It's a real balancing act. I think Mr. Boland, I think you said, talked about the term extremism and harmful content. But I guess that's all in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? I mean, it's difficult to define. And I guess what I want to focus on a little bit is, you know, where do we draw the line in terms of taking down content that we all would agree is extreme and could induce violence versus censoring legitimate political debate? I don't know, Mr. Roeder, do you have any idea what percentage of Twitter employees are conservative versus liberal?
I have no idea.
You think it's probably pretty heavily tilted to the left, correct?
I don't know.
Well, I think you do. Mr. Bowen, would you want to answer that question?
I just don't know. I mean,
okay. Mr. Kane? It's obvious, but
my only knowledge is China tech and TikTok. I'm not as familiar with that area.
So let me move on. Let me use an example that I think we're all aware of. Okay, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Let's talk about the Hunter Biden laptop. Mr. Roeder, do you believe that, like Washington Post, that there's authentic information on that laptop?
I'm not sure. I will say that these are massive platforms. There are billions of pieces of content.
I've got very little time.
Okay. I don't know.
Mr. Bowen, do you know whether, do you assume that's authentic information on the laptop?
I don't have an opinion on the laptop.
Oh, okay. So Twitter was actually very effective when they blocked the New York Post articles on the Hunter Biden laptop. We had Jack Dorsey in front of the Commerce Committee back in, I think, October 2020, and both Senator Cruz and myself asked him, because we were talking about, you know, Russians using the platforms to impact our elections, and everybody agrees that could happen. We asked Mr. Dorsey, do you believe Twitter could impact the election? Mr. Dorsey said no. Mr. Roeder, do you believe Twitter has the capability of impacting the election?
I think all these social platforms, they're so massive, it's hard to believe that they're not impacting.
Mr. Bowen, do you believe that as well?
Yeah, these platforms absolutely have influence, and I believe they influence.
Mr. Kane?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is a problem right there, okay? And I appreciate you acknowledging that fact. You know, we had 51 former intelligence officials. I have no idea on what basis they wrote this letter. They came out immediately. I think it might be, you know, because the FBI had a scheme in August of 2020 to downplay the derogatory information on the Hunter Biden laptop. But they came out and said that the laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. Seems to me like that letter itself was an information operation. So we have this platform that censored. The platform censored that. Facebook throttled it back. We actually took a poll on this. I didn't, but a company called Media Research Center poll. This is after the election, 1,715 voters, 750 voters in 7 swing states of Biden voters who were unaware of the emails, text, testimony, banking transactions on the laptop, as well as Senator Grassley's and my report, which was based on interviews with U.S. persons and U.S. documents. Okay? And 79% of those Biden voters said they would still vote for him, but 16% said they would not. 4% they'd either switch their vote to President Trump, 4% would vote for third party, 4% would skip voting altogether, 5% would not have voted at all. Pretty strong evidence that what Facebook and Twitter did impacted the 2020 election to a far greater extent than anything Russia ever could have hoped to have done in 2016 or 2020. I want to talk about a little other disinformation coming out of this committee. The day or two after Senator Grassley and I issued our report, based on U.S. documents, interviews with U.S. persons, our now committee chairman, who was then committee ranking member, issued a press release, said, Peters Wyden responds to a Republican effort to amplify Russian disinformation. He said, I generated a partisan political report that is rooted in Russian disinformation. Mr. Chairman, do you want to retract that false allegation now? Now that we know that the Hunter Biden laptop is accurate, that there has not been one scintilla of information provided in Senator Grassley's and my report that has ever been refuted. It was 100% accurate. And yet you, as ranking member of the committee, accused me repeatedly of soliciting and disseminating Russian disinformation. Do you want to retract your false allegation here that you issued in your press release on September 23rd?
No, let's just focus on what we're trying to...
Well, I'm focusing on this because this is exactly the type of harm we can do to our political process when you have these big tech companies engaging in political debate, censoring one side of the political spectrum and amplifying the false allegations of another side. Any one of you want to dispute that?
Well, Senator, I think it's important that we get the data to know. This is why the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act is so critical to our globe and our nation, is that if you were able to look at the data to understand what had happened from content moderation and you were able to see the distribution, you could compare that data across the platforms and see what sort of impact that it had. Absent that, there's a lot of conjecture.
So let me just, one part of it, transparency, would be to at least have people who at least used to work or work for these platforms to at least acknowledge the highly political nature of the individuals that work in them. Just acknowledge it. I mean, it's obvious to everybody. I mean, Mr. Zuckerberg spent, what, about $500 million impacting the 2020 election, took over the Green Bay election system in a highly partisan fashion. About 95% of the money he spent were in Democrat strongholds in Wisconsin. Can we at least acknowledge that there's enormous political activity going on, partisan activity going on within these social media companies, rather than just try and bury it? Let's be honest. Let's be transparent. But let's be honest in our transparency.
I agree with you on the request for transparency. In my experience, outside of whether someone had a certain political leaning or not, I didn't see political leanings shape the decisions that were made inside the company, per my experience and what I saw.
Okay, well, I saw it in their censoring the New York Post article prior to the 2020 election.
2009 through November 2020.
November 2020. Was it normal in the time that you were at Facebook for executives or team members at Facebook, not even have to be executives, to coordinate closely with the United States government?
I'm not aware of that.
You were never in any such meetings?
No.
You never had any contact with U.S. government employees in your time at Facebook?
Not that I can recall.
Would you be surprised to know that on July 16th, 2021, an employee at Facebook wrote to the Department of Health and Human Services saying, I know our teams met today to better understand the scope of what the White House expects from us on misinformation going forward. On July 23rd, 2021, Facebook employee thanked HHS for taking the time to meet earlier today. Wanted to make sure you saw the steps we just took this past week to adjust policies and what we are removing with respect to misinformation. That included, I'm quoting, increasing the strength of our demotions for COVID and vaccine-related content. On April 16th, 2021, Rob Flaherty at the White House circulated a Zoom meeting invitation stating White House staff will be briefed on vaccine misinfo. On April 7th, 2021, a Facebook employee thanked the CDC for responding to misinformation queries. We'll get moving now to be able to remove all but that one claim as soon as the announcement and authorization happens. On July 28th, 2022, that's this year, Facebook employee reached out to CDC about doing a monthly misinfo/debunking meeting. CDC responded, yes, we would love to do that. On May 11th, 2021, Facebook employees organized a Be on the Lookout meeting with CDC officials. On July 20th, 2021, Clark Humphrey at the White House emailed Dave Sumner and others at Facebook asking any way we can get this pulled down, and cited an Instagram account. Within 46 seconds, Facebook replied, quote, yep, We are on it, end quote, and down the account went. Is that normal? Was that normal in your time at Facebook?
I don't have experience around that.
So you have no knowledge of anything like this. Nothing like this ever happened, and then presto, it started happening just suddenly in 2020 as soon as you left.
I didn't have personal experience of that, or I didn't hear
And you don't know
about it.
anything about it at all. You've never heard of anything like this happening ever.
I don't.
That's remarkable. I thought that you were the former vice president of partnerships, product marketing, partner engineering, marketing, strategic operations, and analytics at Facebook.
It's true.
And none of this ever happened. Why did it start happening, do you think, as soon as you left? What do you think drove this kind of collaboration where you have Facebook becoming an arm of the United States government, more specifically the White House, to censor private information, personal speech at the behest of government officials?
So it's hard for me to comment on the specific context of the content we're talking about, whether it was public content or whether it was personal content. I do know that from what I've read, and probably the same documents that you have access to, that there were a lot of steps taken around COVID response and COVID misinformation that may have presented a unique scenario and a unique situation where the company took steps to coordinate that way.
Took steps to coordinate, by which you mean to censor the speech of ordinary Americans at the behest of the President of the United States and his administration. I commend to everyone who's interested these emails, which were discovered as part of litigation led by the state of Missouri and other states as they're suing these tech companies, including your former employer, Mr. Boland, which for the record is one of the worst companies in America. And they've discovered this trove of information, extensive coordination, extensive, between Facebook and the Biden administration, targeting the speech of ordinary Americans. And by the way, for standards that are ever shifting, ever shifting. You know, early on, if you questioned if the vaccine had anything to, if you questioned that the COVID had anything to do with a lab, you were marked as disinformation, you were censored, only to have the President of the United States later admit that the possibility that COVID has some lab nexus is in fact a very distinct possibility that our intelligence communities think is actually quite a viable theory. We've seen the same thing with people who have questions about masks, who have questions about vaccine efficacy. It's really quite remarkable. Let me just ask you this. What safeguards, when you were at Facebook, what safeguards were in place to protect Americans from having their speech censored or having government censors like this access personal information?
So during my time there, the company was my experience, the company was more reluctant to take down speech and very careful about trying to remove content. I also don't think the company studied the content on the platform as heavily as you would like.
You don't think that so they didn't do things like, they weren't, not like what they were doing later when they were looking at particular private Instagram accounts and removing them at the behest of the White House? You're saying that didn't happen while you were there?
That's not a scenario that I ran across. It's hard for me to comment on a COVID pandemic response, which I think a lot of things were outside of the norm.
I'll just say this. I find it hard to believe that suddenly Facebook became an entirely different entity and was interfacing with the United States government in an entirely different way only when COVID happened. I mean, maybe, but I doubt it. Let me ask you, Mr. Redder, is that how I pronounce your name, by the way?
Redder, that's correct.
Redder, okay. Let me ask you this. You were an engineer at Twitter, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
You were the senior vice president for engineering?
Yes.
So yesterday, Mr. Zatko testified to another committee I sit on that 4,000 engineers at Twitter had access to all of the personal information, user data, geolocations of Twitter users. Is that accurate?
So I've never met him, and he joined the company after I left, so I don't know if that particular claim is accurate.
But he said all the engineers, you were an engineer. Did you have access to user data?
When I was there, I don't know if it was all the engineers.
Did you have access to user data?
Well, I was the head of engineering for the whole company.
Did you have access to user data? I'm looking for a yes or a no. I'll just remind you.
No.
You didn't have access
I
to
think
user
I
data?
could have gotten it.
I'm sorry?
I think I could have gotten it.
Oh, okay. Well, if you can get it, that's what we call access. So you did have access to user data. Is that a yes?
In theory, I probably could have, yeah.
Sorry?
That's probably right. Yeah, I probably could.
Okay, you did. Did you ever access any user data?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever doxing members of users?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever taking over an account and tweeting out or altering the content of that account? Mr. Zatko said he thought that had happened.
I'm not aware of that.
Lots to unpack there. Thank you. You're Vice President for Engineering.
Yes.
So yesterday, Mr. Zatko testified to another committee I sit on that 4,000 engineers at Twitter had access to all of the personal information, user data, geolocations of Twitter users. Is that accurate?
So I've never met him, and he joined the company after I left, so I don't know if that particular claim is accurate.
But he said all the engineers, you were an engineer. Did you have access to user data?
When I was there, I don't know if it was all the engineers.
Did you have access to user data?
Well, I was the head of engineering for the whole company.
Did you have access to user data? I'm looking for a yes or a no. I'll just remind you.
No.
You didn't have
But
access to user
I think I
data?
could have gotten it.
I'm sorry?
I think I could have gotten it.
Oh, okay. Well, if you can get it, that's what we call access. So you did have access to user data. Is that a yes?
In theory, I probably could have, yeah. That's
Sorry?
probably right. Yeah, I probably could.
Okay, you did. Did you ever access any user data?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever doxing members of users?
No.
Were you aware of Twitter engineers ever taking over an account and tweeting out or altering the content of that account? Mr. Zatko said he thought that had happened.
I'm not aware of that.
Okay.